This is Jesse Zurawell and Perspective on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome to Perspective. I am your host for the hour, Jesse Zurawell. And the first thing I have to say is, wow, that was my first encounter with former Governor Schwarzenegger's plea to Putin regarding the Russian military operation in Ukraine. And there's a lot, I believe, to be said about that unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, we don't have time for today. It's a whole other conversation. But I think one thing it does speak to is the level of collapse, just how far collapsed Western empire is with regard to what's happening now in Ukraine. And the fact that we're supposed to believe that Arnold Schwarzenegger somehow has some insight into what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and that he is going to not only bend Putin's ear, but somehow get through to him, quote unquote, is it would be laughable if people weren't suffering at the hands of some of the worst evils in the world in Ukraine right now. And in a lot of conversations, particularly this week, I've gotten into the many moving parts of what's happening in Ukraine. And yesterday I spoke with Alex Craner, and we talked about how this is a Western Empire driven operation, if you will, what we're seeing now, that Russia was pushed into reacting because it is facing an existential threat from Western empire. And this threat is driven primarily by the international banking cartels who seek to dominate Eurasia, who seek to balkanize Russia in order to do so. And they're willing to go to the lowest levels of depravity, or perhaps the highest levels of depravity, to do so, including working with outright Nazis, which they've been doing. Nazis who are, by many reliable accounts I've received, murdering civilians on the ground, seemingly for sport in some cases. And we've also seen Ukraine become a cauldron of sorts for some of, again, the worst evils this world has to offer. So we're talking about Nazism, we're talking about Wahhabism, the 450 extremist fighters from Syria who recently arrived in Ukraine. We're talking about Zionism. We're talking about bioweapons. And I believe, too, that we are talking about eugenics. And that is something that's often been undiscussed, or at least under-discussed in the conversation, or the conversation surrounding what's happening in Ukraine. And here with me today to delve into that aspect, the history of eugenics, as well as how it applies to what's happening in Ukraine, and also what's happened over the past 2 years with the COVID-19 project, is Matthew Ehret. Matthew joined me on the program several weeks ago to discuss technocracy in particular. Technocracy and eugenics are bedfellows, if you will. And I'm very happy to have Matthew back. He's a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's the founder of Canadian Patriot Review. He's a journalist. He's a historian. He's provided some excellent testimony for Reiner Fuellmix's Corona Investigative Committee, which I highly recommend viewing. If you haven't, you can find that on Odyssey. So Matthew, welcome back to Perspective. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Jesse, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Great. So I want to start with the origins of eugenics and the history of it before we talk about how I believe it very much is at work in what we see going on today, particularly with regard to the COVID-19 project, and arguably even more so with what's happening in Ukraine. So what are the origins of this movement, if you will?
Yeah, that's a fair place to start. And it's important, to get some of this contextual history in our minds when we're evaluating our present circumstances, because without that, we are inclined to make all sorts of missteps. And there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of traps spread out throughout the mental sort of collective zeitgeist that causes us to lose our footing and thus lose our ability to think through solution concepts needed when we're in an age, after all, of a controlled blowout of this financial system or this bubble that once was a viable financial system many decades ago, before you and I were even born. We once had an industrial economy, especially during that post 30-year period after World War II. The idea of economics, if you read a textbook from the 1940s or 50s of economics and you compare it to a modern textbook, it's a very different way of thinking. It's a different paradigm, and money back then was understood more clearly as something which had to serve the interests of national interest, of the welfare of the people, by investing into large-scale infrastructure, in maintaining and improving, introducing new scientific discoveries that would allow humankind to overcome limits to growth. Because we're always going to encounter limits to our existence based on the ignorance that we will always be facing. So we're always reliant upon a certain set of relationships to resources that are limited, based upon a given level of technology and understanding that we have. So today, we have currently 8 billion people. This would have been impossible a century ago, where here in Montreal, where I live, the average life expectancy was about 45 years of age. Today, it's about 80. Although we've lost 2 years on average under the last 2 years of COVID, that has gone down dramatically. 100 years earlier, in 1799, you could have supported many fewer people because we didn't know electricity. We hadn't discovered that yet, or we hadn't figured out how to apply it, at least to the productive process. We were still burning wood. We barely were using coal. So you just see how there's a relationship between the mental faculties of creative reason, this thing which is not something which you can, you can't weigh an idea on a scale. You can't cut an idea in half. These are thought concepts. When we make a eureka, a great creative discovery, and we translate that into a new technology, there's a direct relationship between a metaphysical and physical process of mind and matter. And this has been something which has been tackled by philosophers for a very long time. It's been a very important, the idea of how ideas interact with society and with the material world is very potent. And I think gets us to the heart of the question of eugenics. The American Revolution, which was in many ways a brainchild of Ben Franklin, who was the founding father of founding fathers, was a refutation of the idea that we are just cattle to be herded in a feudal estate, like talking cows or something like that, controlled by the landowners or the lords, which was the way things were run for most of human history in various ways, the majority of the time. So, the idea of the American Revolution, which was in Ben Franklin's mind, the guy who discovered the nature of electricity and translated that and innovated a new way of having patents, like facilitating the means of citizens who are not born of high blood to be able to develop their higher powers of thinking, of curiosity, and translating those into new discoveries that could then be brought into the economic systems. These were things that in Ben Franklin's mind were part and parcel of the drive to create a republic for the first time, a society organized not around hereditary structures, but around the idea of the consent of the governed, and the idea that every individual is sovereign with inalienable rights. And that's where the mandate for the laws of a society, economic and political, they emanate from that idea that had never existed before. And so the idea of the breakthroughs in science and the breakthroughs in political economy of 1776 are one and the same thing. And that's a very important idea, because the old British Empire and the hereditary structures of empire, of these inbred bloodlines who thought, that there was something superior to their family genetic stock because they were the ones born into an elite master class, going back to the days of ancient Babylon and the Roman Empire, This is a long hereditary structure of a belief that because you're born into the rich class, there's something better about you. And the way that they prove this is in this lazy way that, well, if the poor were actually better than us, then they would be exploiting us. So we must be actually superior genetically in some way. Even before the word genetics came about, that was believed. So here you have Benjamin Franklin, a guy with like a grade 3 education, making these amazing discoveries and then creating institutions that are encouraging others to do the same and creating a complete new way of arranging society was a scary thing for these oligarchs. And one of the characters who was cooked up in the halls of the British Empire to try to refute this idea that came out of the American Revolution, especially, was Thomas Malthus. Mm-hmm. Thomas Malthus was a British East India Company economist. He trained generations of British East India Company sociopaths. He was nominally a parson, a man of the cloth. But he was really a Satanist. There's a lot of evidence of that. And he introduced a mathematical theory based on the idea that human populations will always grow geometrically, food will always grow arithmetically. And so you can calculate, if you're a scientific manager of a society, you can calculate when you're going to have a population crisis, and you can mitigate that crisis by encouraging, plague, war, disease, other things. Starvation was a big tool of the Malthusians, like they did in Ireland or in India, to keep the population down and keep discoveries at a minimal. So keep the mind as divided as possible, so that the minds of people can't actually overcome their limits to growth, but they just adapt like other animals in an ecosystem to whatever limits the zookeepers set for them. Right. The problem was, in the 19th century, the Malthusian notion was refuted again and again, especially driven by this optimistic American culture, which really valued scientific and technological progress. And the US population increased fourfold in its first 50 years. It's an incredible dramatic raise, but not just in quantity, but also in quality, life expectancy, every variable that's positive you can look at, you had improvement because the application and embrace of new discoveries and their application into society. So Malthus fell out of favor. People didn't really believe that this really was a legit way of organizing society. So the eugenicist thing was sort of the way to retweak Malthus's refuted ideas. And basically, there was somebody named Francis Galton, a cousin of Darwin. And what he wanted to do was take some new ideas and discoveries in Mendelian genetics, that there is something in our, there's something in our genes that has a connection to the general attributes of, or whether a plant will have a big leaf or what color its leaf is, or what whether we'll have a big nose that will pass down to our kids or something. Like there's these certain correlations, and right. He basically took that plus Darwinian systems, explanatory models that had recently been publicized around the idea of the survival of the fittest in nature being that which determines which species will survive and which species will go extinct. And apply it to human societal organization. And so that's what he did. And he called it eugenics, the weeding out of the unfit of society in order to bring about a better species. And the thing here that was very dangerous is who's determining the metrics of better and worse is a bunch of inbred elites who are right. What Francis Galton is beholden to, who are saying, and part of the fraud of this statistical science, and Galton admits it is a purely statistical science because it's based upon like this idea that, well, look, you have a low IQ, your dad has a low IQ, your granddad had a low IQ, so it's statistically probable that your great-grandchildren, who may not even exist yet, will have a low IQ. And based upon such considerations, which we then will link to something in your blood, something genetic, we can justify sterilizing you or other. And they will completely ignore.
It's really applying mathematical absolutes to something that isn't absolute, and that is basically nature itself. Nature it doesn't conform to these absolute mathematical models.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, these guys will obviously they always ignore the unjust, unnatural socioeconomic systems that those victims that they're determining who lives and who dies are living in and are being told to adapt in, because the empire that Malthus, even Charles Darwin himself, who was beholden and largely handled by a sociopathic imperialist named Thomas Huxley, his bulldog, and then also his cousin, the founder of Eugenics. These guys were all beholden to a globally extended master-slave system of exploitation, which was always in defiance of the laws of nature and would only exist by destroying the fabric of our own species, by making people dumber, making them more divided to fight each other, divide to conquer. That's one of the mechanisms, keeping everybody dependent upon middlemen, so that no nation in the British Empire's model of how things should work has full spectrum economic sovereignty. Everybody stays dependent upon doing, cash cropping of one thing. India produces the opium, China produces the tea, then smokes the opium that's produced, that's shipped there from by the British. Everyone's addicted to the Bank of England's controls and the central banks above nation states who control the rates of interest, the rules of the speculative markets. So, they don't look at that. They just say, oh, if there's poverty, it's because it's in your genetics. And thus they start then applying predictive or measures to solve those problems of low quality humans, which, involves what the US was doing. So between 1907 and 1933, the United States, 33 states within the US itself, before even Hitler started on this, were already applying eugenics as a form of population control. And 2 of the provinces of Canada were doing this too. It was taught in Harvard and all of the major universities, not, as just a fact that you have to accept. And then Hitler, said, okay, well, look at the successful models being done in the US, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Massey Foundation. Let's do that here. And he was just, he had a form of government, a fascist form that bypassed a lot of the democratic institutions that made it much more easy to go full hog on this eugenics program. And we saw the hyperbolic increase of the killing of even Germans who were deemed too expensive to keep alive under Hitler's healthcare reforms in the 1930s, Tiergarten 4. I think it was over 250,000 Germans, before they even got around to other races, were exterminated.
Right. That's the T4 program.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we should note, too, that Hitler was largely bankrolled by the city of London, which is where a lot of the people we've been talking about, they come from that cabal, that clique, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so important for people to hold in mind, because they're like, oh, we won World War II. It's like, well, yeah, kind of. But at the same time, something was left highly under-resolved, which was that those families, those Wall Street and the London bankers and industrialists who, this used to be known much more clearly generations ago than it is today, who funded Hitler, who bankrolled fascism, who bankrolled the funding of eugenics. They were never punished in Nuremberg. I've seen no evidence that they reformed or, changed, like Prescott Bush, right? The patriarch of the Bush family worked for both Brown Brothers Harriman, one of the biggest eugenics. Averell Harriman and the Harriman family was one of the biggest sponsors of eugenics besides the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s and 30s. But he also, during that time, he provided a massive, I think it was $100 million in loans to Hitler when Hitler's Nazi party was bankrupt in 1933, and Hitler was contemplating suicide. He was bailed out by these Wall Street banks led by Prescott Bush, who initiated a lot of this. And then later on, Prescott went to work as a director of a union banking corporation, which was found to be guilty for trading with the enemies after the U.S. had entered World War II in 1941. This is something that people have just been, it's been put down the memory hole and scrubbed, but they weren't alone, and this is all over London too. Things like the Bank of International Settlements, which is to this very day the regulator of global derivatives, the source of the thing that has become the time bomb that has been set to blow out our global financial system back in the early 70s. But the Bank of International Settlements was set up by the Bank of England. People like Montague Norman, a radical eugenicist. This thing was set up originally in 1930 to help facilitate the debt repayments from the Versailles Treaty from the Germans to the victor nations. But the reality was this thing was used as an instrument to facilitate filling the Nazi coffers with the money from every country that the Nazis took over, from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria. This banking interest is very, very, it's a very important underreported component of World War II history. And it's underreported because those who write the history books and fund which fields of research get money and publishing are tied to those very bankers who tried to get Hitler to be the enforcer of the New World Order back in the 1930s and 40s. They wanted Hitler to win, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. They had a whole design, and Alex Craner has written extensively about this. I'm glad that you had him on recently. He's written extensively on the original 1930s designs for the New World Order, with an Anglo-American fascist alliance with the Nazis, with Mussolini, with Franco, who would all carve up, with the Japanese fascists, who had all planned a grand design to carve up the world in districts, all enforced by fascist eugenics doctrines, but ultimately all controlled by the same bankers' dictatorship from the top, which had to be aborted at the time because people are like, oh, but they have so much power. Why didn't they get what they wanted? And it's like, well, they have a lot of power, but they don't necessarily understand the system that they're trying to control and manipulate, which is why they often build things that blow up in their faces like a Frankenstein monster, which is why, again, people should take a little bit of hope again today that this oligarchy that does wield a lot of power with its the current incarnation of eugenics, which we could talk about later, in the form of this Great Reset. They've got this ivory tower mathematical model of the way that they think that the world should work in their utopian fantasies, but it doesn't conform to how reality and how human nature actually is. So Hitler didn't obey. He realized with all of this military might that he had accumulated with the help of the bankers themselves, mostly from London, that he didn't have to be a second stringer in the New World Order. He could have the dominant position and have the British oligarchs as his junior partner. And some of the British oligarchs were more than happy to go along with that, not least of which was the King of England himself, Edward VIII, sorry. The one who was forced to abdicate at a certain point. They cooked up a little scandal because it was embarrassing that he was like teaching everybody how to do the Hitler salute and stuff. But there was always a plan to reinstall him back as the Nazi King of England. Neville Chamberlain and the whole roundtable cabinet that he was working with Lord Halifax and others, they were more than happy all the way up until 1940 to still play along with that, to be second stringers and maybe in the next generation take back control again. But then there's a faction fight, and we could see that a grouping within the British Empire didn't want to go that path, realized they created a monster and had to put it down. So that whole thing got reorganized. The world got to see the ugliness of eugenics finally in 1945-46 when the word got out of what the consequence of this scientific management of population actually looked like when applied in reality. They were horrified. And people like Julian Huxley, another lifelong eugenicist, a president of the British Eugenics Society, who co-founded, or he was the founder of UNESCO in 1946. Right. He writes the manifesto where he's like, well, he's clear, and people can read the PDF of this thing. It's somehow still online. He's like, well, eugenics is the most important queen of all sciences, but we can't use that word anymore because Hitler made it become unthinkable as a science. But it's still very important. So what we need to do, speaking to his cast, is in the post-war age, make the unthinkable become thinkable and repackage eugenics under new forms, but with the same effect. And again, his blood-curdling manifesto for UNESCO goes through the details of this. They need to overcome nation states, get rid of the belief in family and the idea of religious traditions, which make people less inclined to adapt to this technocratic mode of being. You could also see the things like the World Health Organization, which also grew out of this process, run by a Tavistokian a psychiatrist who is a total misanthrope named G. Brock Chisholm. He worked very closely with Julian Huxley. And he's also very clear that the view in his mind of the cause of all of the wars of society of World War II is located in a mental dysfunction, which is caused by the belief in nation states, in family traditions, and the respect for religious traditions, which he says if we just can heal humankind, especially focusing on the young, those born after World War II especially, right, the baby boomers, focus on the next generation, think longer term, and heal society from this delusion of these three evils, then we can create a society of a perfect world government that accepts a scientifically managed society unencumbered by obsolete ideas of morality and right and wrong. And Chisholm, again, founder of the World Health Organization, is explicit in his words, and I cite them in a lot of my articles, just to get across, like, this is the mandate of these fundamental organizations. I'm going to skip a lot of stuff here, but if you ask, like, well, what did they do? Let me
just pause you there for a moment, because we need to take a break. But I just want to say that building off of the last discussion you and I had, you bring up this point of thinking long term. And that is how these technocrats work, as we spoke about last time. They think long term. They work by attrition and permeation, or penetration, as Klaus Schwab likes to put it. So I do want to pick up on this when we get back, and also talk about, because this is something you alluded to at the end of your most recent testimony for Reiner Fulmich's committee. How this is, how eugenics is something we're seeing manifest itself or operate with what's happening in Ukraine. So I want to get into that as well. So more with Matthew Ehret after this quick break.
You should hear what Mike Ryan's talking about.
Why would you want, except for that gas field, why would you ever want to invade Ukraine? It sounds like a pretty... without being disrespectful, sounds like a pretty miserable place.
Well, nobody's invading Ukraine. Ukraine fired on the Russian bloc post this morning, the border post. Mm-hmm. Now, all of this, even the recognition of the republics, LNR and DNR, was a final push to try to get Zelensky back at the table for Minsk agreements. If those aren't going to happen, and the massive buildup just west of the contact line is going on, with increased artillery attacks, soldiers, special operations, Ukrainians, special operations, have entered both regions of Donbass, both capital cities, and they're blowing up evacuees. They're setting 200-pound, 200-kilo bombs under bridges that evacuees have to go by. They're blowing up the cars of local leadership. They're attacking more and more civilian structures.
Mike Ryan on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
My name is Latoya Adams. I served in the Army. Being with Paralyzed Veterans of America, they have showed me so much is possible.
I'm Sean Castle, served in the United States Army. I went from laying in a hospital bed dying to being a professional wheelchair basketball player. And it started with that one moment where there's life. I am unstoppable because Paralyzed Veterans of America is by my side.
We are unstoppable.
Learn more at pva.org.
You have the right to know. The right to know about culture. The right to know about the economy. The right to know about technology and to know about sports. You have the right to know about education and politics and the weather. You have the right to know what's happening abroad and in your backyard. But above all else, you have the right to know that this right is under attack, and we must work to protect it. Because in order to be free, we must be informed. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.
As Joe Biden negotiates his way out of the room, we don't negotiate with the truth. We mandate that the truth be told. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to Perspective. I am your host for the rest of the hour, Jesse Zurawell, and I've been speaking with Matthew Ehret. Matthew is a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He is the founder of Canadian Patriot Review. He is a journalist. He's a historian. And we've been discussing eugenics, something I believe is very much at play in what we're seeing happen now in Ukraine, and something that has been very much at play over the past 2 years with regard to the COVID-19 agenda. And in the first half of the show, we delved into the origins and history of the eugenics movement, and just how tied it is to the international banking cartels, which I believe, and I think a lot of honest observers would agree, the international banking cartel is manipulating a lot of what we're seeing happen, at least from the Western Empire side. And they are responsible for provoking Russia into this conflict because they have financial interests, their existential financial interests that they need to fulfill, and that requires, it very much seems, dismantling Russia, disempowering it completely, destroying it for control of Eurasia, for both the natural resource capital that's there as well as the human capital that's there. And something that my guest yesterday made very clear is that this international banking class, this cartel, is willing to go to the most psychopathic lengths possible or imaginable to preserve itself. And I think we're very much seeing that play out in Ukraine right now. And we've seen it play out over the past 2 years with the COVID-19 agenda. So Matthew, before the break, we were talking about some of the key players involved in reviving the eugenics movement. And I know there's a lot we could unpack there, and a lot that unfortunately we have to skip over due to time constraints. So I want to dive right into how eugenics is operating with what we're seeing happen in the world right now, particularly with regard to Ukraine and also the past 2 years with the COVID-19 agenda. My contention being that, as I said, the international banking cartel, which is the steward of Western empire, is willing to go to the utmost lengths of depravity to preserve itself and its power. And that includes reducing human populations by means of working with the worst elements imaginable. And although, that may not be their end goal in what's happening, it certainly it benefits them for populations to be reduced, for people to be slaughtered en masse. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I would like to talk about how eugenics applies to what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we're running short on time, and so it's a shame that we have to, by necessity, skip over and oversimplify. But that's vital, that to keep in mind that ultimately there is this obsessive quasi-religious drive ultimately to reduce the world population down to what mathematical computer models that they've been using, especially since the early 70s, have been saying is acceptable, sustainable quantities. I think the relative consensus from these Club of Rome funded programs, these models, have calculated about 1 billion people. Sometimes it's open for debate, 2 billion, 500 million, it fluctuates, but it's a false debate. Because again, like I said at the beginning, this whole thing is founded upon a certain false assumption that human beings are just another form of talking animal with the same constraints faced by other animal populations that are extended to human beings. The reality is that unlike animals, like, Abraham Lincoln made this point that beavers make dams, but the quality of dams that we see from beavers making dams today compared to those that we've seen that beavers were making 5,000 years ago are qualitatively no different. Human beings are the only species that improves our workmanship through discoveries and inventions. These are metaphysical things that you cannot chart in a computer model. So they're religiously committed to this thing, and they masquerade behind the term science. Just quick, the World Economic Forum, the technocratic sort of neo-Malthusian overhaul or revolution that took place over the dead bodies of people who were anti-Malthusian, like John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Enrico Mattei. There's so many people in the 60s who fought against this and who were mowed down in order to bring about this type of regime change, of this paradigm shift that, again, targeted the baby boomer generation. The idea was to transfer our values from being protect humankind against empires to protecting nature from humans. So one of the things Julian Huxley did is he created the environmental movement as it is known today, with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Wildlife Fund, which he created with Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip, and a bunch of other organizations as well. The eugenics movement transformed itself into things like Engender Health, which is a major organization working with Bill Gates's Gavi and the World Health Organization today. The Galton Institute, which had its name changed from it was once the British Eugenics Society. That name change only happened in 1989. That is also closely working with AstraZeneca, Oxford, and Gavi. A lot of these things were at the heart of this corruption of health science in especially the early 70s, and the creation of this big pharmaceutical complex above nation states. So it's all sort of different aspects of the same thing. I don't want people to get too caught up in the details of it, but these are different branches of the same operation. Julian Huxley also was the founder of the term transhumanism, which is at the heart of this religion for the master class that we hear from people like Yuval Harari and Klaus Schwab, that we're going to merge human beings with machines, with CRISPR technology, and create a new type of society, a new type of species favorable to the ruling class. And the new selectors of nature are not random mutations, as they say was formerly the case under Darwinian rules, but rather it will be the CEOs of Google and Facebook and the World Economic Forum is how they spin it. It's all bunk. This is not real science. And I say this is a religious, an anti-human religion. And this is why they're really afraid. This gets at the heart of Ukraine, because what they're on, I think everyone knows at this point that there has been a continuity of second, third generation Nazis through Azovs and other things, maintaining a sort of mythos that the bad guys of World War II were actually the Russians, and the Germans, the Nazis, were not so bad after all. They glorify people like Stefan Bandera, Mikhail Lebed, these Ukrainian fascist eugenics pro-Nazis. These are national heroes by these crowds in Ukraine today, which is what Putin talks about when he says we're going to denazify. Russia, China, India, the whole Eurasian grouping of leading nations right now has announced the creation of a new alternative financial security economic architecture, more recently this week under Sergei Glaziev's helm, one of Putin's leading collaborators, a very strong anti-Malthusian figure. Who has announced the creation of a new project to, again, create a new currency outside of the control of the collapsing petrodollar of the West. Saudi Arabia has even announced that they're going to allow for the sale and of oil from Saudi Arabia in yuan. Many countries now are jumping on board with this other system, which increasingly has an orientation towards the things that America used to do, like national banking, the greenback type system of Lincoln. That's the sort of credit mechanisms that we see building large scale infrastructure in science. And the point I often make in a lot of my writings is that other Eurasian partnership is founded upon a different type of operating system, which is it's not a Malthusian closed system where you have to adapt to scarcity. It's based upon large scale, long-term thinking, which is open system. It's based upon the introduction of new discoveries into the productive process, which allows you to overcome. It's driven by the overcoming of limits to growth. That's why it is incompatible fundamentally with the type of Great Reset depopulation agenda, which has been on the books now for many decades. These countries, Russia especially, and China, were all supposed to be in the same building that was going to be detonated when the time was ripe for the this massive chaos moment, this shock therapy trauma that was supposed to be done in order to get human beings to submit to a new type of ethic of depopulation. This idea of a Green New Deal for getting rid of fossil fuels, nuclear power, put it all in the garbage bin has been the design. And instead adapt to think little, think small, think about green windmills and solar panels instead of what we've been using now, which the effect of these things, if you get society addicted, as they're doing currently, they're doubling down in Europe. Germany is shutting down all of its nuclear within, I think, by the end of this year. All across Europe happens.
It's economic suicide is what's happening.
Yeah, I think of it in many ways as a sacrifice, as a pagan type of mass sacrifice of the Europeans, of many of the Americans and North Americans as a whole, to this Gaia type cult that's been revived from the ancient Babylonian mystery schools. Like, these people are thinking long term, and they've wanted to get rid of Judeo-Christian ethic or systems of thinking for a very long time, and replace it with a restored, as Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary both describe in their own writings, the need to get rid of Christianity and replace it with a new humanist paganism. This has been a part of the blueprint now for quite some time, and it is satanic. Ultimately, they have a certain Luciferian agenda driving them. You see that when you just look at. If I can
just add to that, there's an interesting, or I suppose more than interesting, but there is a parallel we should note with regard to the neo-paganism, in that a lot of the Nazi elements that are operating in Ukraine right now subscribe to a form of neo-paganism. You see, we've all seen the Black Sun symbol, which comes from Himmler's castle, which has, as you laid out in your testimony to Reiner Fuellmix's committee, it has no meaning to it, but it's been adopted as, I guess, a symbol of subscribing to this neo-paganism that Himmler himself subscribed to. So we do see that neo-paganism playing out with these horrible factions operating in Ukraine right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, people miss that. But yeah, there was a satanic religious component to the inner echelons of Nazism. They tried to maintain a veneer of being Christian, and they had their own Reichs church, like with their own approved version of the Bible, to portray a sort of quasi-Christianity. But at the heart of it, the inner sanctum of the elites of Nazism were all members of the Thule Society. They were into this occult, satanic, ritualistic insanity. And yeah, you see all of these symbols, like you just pointed out, the black occult sun, all over the Azov. It's on the Azov flag, the thing that's been receiving U.S. training, Canadian government training money to support their insane war against the impure Russian races. Because this version, this variant of nationalism in Ukraine, I'm a nationalist, but this is not real nationalism. This is a blood and soil cult, where their version of nationalism is anybody who has impure blood or contamination. The Muscovites, the Jews, everything should be ultimately cleansed from our society geographically in order to create this mythos. This is what animated the Nazi views as well, including plant life.
I was just going to say, if you look at the Pravi sector or right sector's flag, it's red and black instead of the Ukrainian flag, which is blue and yellow for the sky and for the wheat fields. You have the red and black, which is supposed to symbolize blood and soil, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was the same flag that our deputy prime minister here in Canada got in trouble for waving at a recent solidarity march in Toronto with Ukrainians. She was holding Organization for Ukrainian Nationalist flags, black and red, and had to take it off her Twitter account after like 12 hours. But yeah, no, exactly. And it's the case, as I mentioned earlier, the Nuremberg trials didn't actually deal with the cause of World War II. There were some people were killed. A few were hung, low-level expendables. But many of the forces, including many Nazi forces who carried out the worst atrocities, were never punished. They were simply incorporated into the Anglo-American intelligence operations during the Cold War as a new weapon to fight communism. And so this is what was known as the stay-behinds under Operation Gladio, created out of the offices of the CIA and NATO, that took people like Rainer Gellin, the Hitler's former intelligence chief, and simply brought him back in to be the commander, the controller of West German intelligence with his entire operation. People like Stefan Bandera were brought into the Gehlen networks from Ukraine, absolved of all their crimes of killing over 100,000 Poles and Jews during World War II, and instead just became an asset of the CIA, of NATO, to carry out, again, the war against the communism. And everything became justified under that era of the Cold War. So this is what is now today active in the case of Ukraine, but also more broadly. And the bankers, again, above the show who funded this thing never stopped their agenda of utilizing radicalized perversions of different ideologies, including what they did with the funding of radical Islam in the late 70s under Zbigniew Brzezinski. And his strategy of destroying Russia in Ukraine by just funding radical madrasas with the help of some Saudi oil barons who were more than happy to fund Wahhabite radical versions and variants of Islam, provide them with hundreds of millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer-funded weapons to fight the Soviets. But ultimately, this created a very foreseeable problem. Right, all of Al Qaeda grew out of this thing, which continued to receive CIA support and U.S. aid and other forms of Western intelligence support logistically and financially through the overthrow of Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad's Syria. And so it's not a surprise that we still see these groups now being funneled into Ukraine to fight alongside their Nazi brothers, 450 of which had been recently reported, some of whom had been quickly killed, but still they're there, receiving, $1,200 a month they're getting paid, which is a lot of money if you've been fighting in Syria. Now they're turning jihad against the Russians.
I believe the Syrian nationals are receiving $1,200, and nationals, other nationals are receiving an undisclosed amount. But supposedly it's acceptable payment, I think is the line that's been put out, that they're being compensated acceptably for their wonderful services.
Amazing, eh? Just amazing.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. So these are just two sides of the same thing, and as soon as you get into that logic of the ends justify the means, you go down the path of hell. And to the degree that even good people succumbed to this logic, people who were not part of the inner echelon planning committees, to this idea that, we gotta win the Cold War, so we'll just go along with this crazy ass strategy or that one. You undo the future, and you create something that will blow up in your face. And again, the fact that Russia, China are unwilling to remain in that collapsing building, they're like, why are we gonna be in this controlled demolition? They've established an alternative security architecture, financial architecture, increasingly with state banking tied to the idea that we can have an open system of constant growth. That only works if you have a robust scientific program with a look towards greening deserts, which is what both of these countries are definitely looking towards, and especially space exploration, which again, both of these countries, Russia and China especially, have an integrated space program increasingly, because you have to see humankind as not bound simply to this closed idea of the Earth alone. The Earth is moving around a sun at like 3,000 kilometers a second, in a very robust, creative galaxy where, if you have to have a multi-generational outlook, thinking about maybe terraforming other planets over the course of 80 years or more, you have to think in those long-term methods. Asteroid defense, other things have to be part of your economic basket of considerations if you're going to be able to overcome the argument that we're overpopulated, which these eugenicists and Malthusians are always trying to trap us into, which is like, well, the world is still finite. At what point are you going to accept the fact that you have to have quotas of population? And it's like, that's a hard argument for a lot of good people to refute unless they get their minds into a bigger galactic place. And people like JFK were thinking in those terms, which is why he was one of the reasons why he was mowed down, is he was getting people to think about human beings as a galactic species capable of constant discoveries forever. There's no reason why you should have an end to that idea. So that's what's, I think, at the heart. I mean, NASA has been attacked and undermined from within for a long time. There's a reason why Apollo was shut down before we could even start doing any of the things that we were planning on doing in the 60s. Nuclear rockets were shut down.
Only 20% of its funding or its budget goes toward actual space exploration, which a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, and under Obama and John Holdren, the rabid depopulationist who ran U.S. science policy, this thing was gutted and was turned into like just something which primarily surveys ecosystems as part of the Green New Deal orientation. It was completely gutted. And part of the attrition of NASA has been also just not giving the tools and the means for creative scientists to carry out their work, and constantly changing projects every couple of years, which demoralizes scientists. A lot of the people who actually had the real life knowledge to build things creatively are in their 80s, 90s or dead. We've lost a generation, and now it's like we got to almost rebuild from scratch. They shut down and retired all of the space shuttles, so the U.S. has had to use Russia just to get into orbit. It's old Soyuz spacecrafts. It dismantled all of our cutting edge technology, and people wonder why we couldn't even put a toaster back on the moon today if we wanted to. It's because we dismantled everything, and that was the agenda, was to get us to get into this little cage, this closed system cage, and have us adapt to scarcity. And shut down everything like nuclear fusion technology. Was all of these prototypes that were being built were all canceled. So again, we're losing real living knowledge. And I think that gets at the heart of one of the biggest crises that we're facing right now, is this demographic issue, where young people who are training to be engineers are only being trained by computer models. They're not building things. So they get into the real world and they don't know how to do anything. That's what we have to recover. And China and Russia are recovering it in a good way. They're actually building things. China can build, 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, magnetic levitation. They've got a plan for building a space research center together within the decade on the moon. They're mining helium. They're planning on mining helium-3 for fusion power on the far side of the moon. It's abundant there. There's none of it on Earth. So they're thinking very long-term, and we're just still stuck in the dark age way of thinking about just like, anyway, I don't have to go into details, but yeah.
So I think that's an excellent analysis, and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing it with us. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there for the hour, but Matthew Ehret, thank you again for your time. Much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Take care.